This is a podcast from Seven Vineyard.
Good morning. It's lovely to be with you. And Kyle declared that it is spring, but I think I'm going to go one better and declare that it's summer. Happy summer, folks. That might be slightly dangerous, but what I'm saying is enjoy it, embrace it for as long as it lasts. It's so good, isn't it, to feel warm. I'm not sure if it's really summer or even spring for that matter, but in terms of rhythm and calendar, what I am sure of is that we're now just 2 weeks away from Easter and celebrating Easter Sunday, which is wonderful. And so that's the kind of part of our year that we're in. And so what I want to share with you today are just a couple of thoughts that I've been kind of mulling over, chewing on during this time, looking at the events of that first Easter. And the first one is about Jesus as a leader, what kind of leader he was, what his leadership style was, and how I think this offers what is still a pretty revolutionary alternative to many of the models and methods of leadership that we see in the world today. And the second thought is about the strange way that God's power, God's love, God's victory is demonstrated in that first Easter, not through strength, but through weakness. So that's kind of where we're going, and I'll just be unpacking a few of those thoughts with you. Can we just pray as we start? Just give this time to God. Father, we thank you so much for our time with you so far, that you are present, that we sense your love. Thank you for those words of affirmation and encouragement in the songs, that as we've given you our praise, we've also sensed you turning your gaze towards us, and we've sensed the warmth of your love. And I pray that that would continue, Lord, as we look at your word, as we look at some of the examples from your life here on earth. Lord, may we continue to get a little insight into what you're like, into who you are, into who the God that we worship is. In Jesus' name, amen. As I was preparing for today, I was reminded of something that happened way back at the turn of the millennium. Some of you in this room, it's a bit scary, but some of you are not old enough to remember that. But for those of us who are, it was quite a significant date, right? It was, going to turn from 1999 to 2000, and you might be able to remember where you were, what you were doing. For me, I was a student at the time in Nottingham, and I had the opportunity to take a job down in London at the Royal Albert Hall. I was not performing. I was a waiter at the Royal Albert Hall, but it was a chance to earn a couple of £100 in an evening, which as a student at the time was big money. And unfortunately, I managed to spill all of the ice creams during the interval at the show. I had them in a tray with a strap around my neck, and somehow I got the balance of this thing wrong, and the tubs of ice cream went rolling around the floor. So that was how I mostly remember the millennium. But there were some other significant things happening at the time, and one of them, which was also in London, was a big debate about the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square. Now, some of you will be familiar with the fourth plinth. If you visit Trafalgar Square, you'll know that at the center of this huge plaza is Nelson's column, and then there are 4 huge plinths with statues on, or rather 3 of them with statues on, and one that has remained empty. And that's because in 1843, when Trafalgar Square was open to the public, there were supposed to be statues of King George IV, King William IV, and 2 heroes from the British Raj, Sir Henry Havelock and Sir Charles James Napier. However, due to insignificant funds, the 4th statue was never installed. So in 1999, one of the things that people thought would be appropriate about the, celebrating the millennium would be to install a new statue. And the debate was, well, who should it be of? Should it be of Churchill or of Queen Victoria perhaps, or of Shakespeare? In the end, I think common sense prevailed, and a statue of Jesus was chosen. A nod to the fact that the millennium, the calendar that we follow, was somehow linked to the birth of somebody way back when. But when the statue was unveiled, that debate was only enraged. because the statue that was unveiled to the public was by an artist called Mark Wallinger, and it was named Ecce Homo. I'm hoping that you can see it there on the screen. Ecce Homo means behold the man. That's a phrase that Pilate used when Jesus was brought out into the public before his death. And people who saw it were mostly taken aback, because what they saw was a life-size statue of Jesus, but it was a mere fraction of the size of the plinth that it stood on. He was naked apart from a loincloth. His hands were tied behind his back, and he had a gold-plated barbed wire crown of thorns on his bald head. Jesus just looked tiny and insignificant, and it was such a contrast to the grandeur of the square, to Nelson's column way up there in the sky, even to imagery of Jesus that was so popular. You know, where were his beard? Where was his long hair? His halo, his robes? Why did he look so tiny and vulnerable? One person commented, "You couldn't put your faith in someone like that. He's as weak as a kitten." And one of the UK's leading Christian magazines expressed its concern too and said, "It's a statue of weakness. Will it send out the wrong signals?" See, we live in a world where might is right, where strength is shown through force and through taking control, and where more and more countries seem to be electing leaders who portray themselves as strong, right? You know, the strong man. And their opponents are portrayed as weak or dangerous. It's important for leaders to protect our interests. Not only that, but the threat of violence is used to keep ourselves at the top. We live in an era where nuclear war is avoided by having nuclear weapons. And it's actually pretty scary. And many who claim to follow Jesus buy into this mentality. You know, we've seen that in the United States particularly. Don't want to go into that too much, but where evangelical Christians are one of the main supporters or the support bases for the America First movement. Might is right. We look after number one. But the challenge for us, particularly as we approach Easter, is that we're confronted with a series of events in Jesus' life that demonstrate that in God's kingdom and in God's equation, the exact opposite is actually true. That God's power is somehow, incredibly, mysteriously demonstrated through voluntary weakness. That true leadership is shown through service and through sacrificial love. So I want us to look together at a moment in this Easter story, just building up to Easter story, where Jesus kind of flips on its head the expected model of leadership that the Messiah was supposed to bring, and indeed what I think the world today may be buying into. So it happens on the night, on the eve of his crucifixion, on what we now call Maundy Thursday, when Jesus invited his disciples for a meal. And their expectation was that they were coming together to celebrate the Passover. This is something that they did every year, to remember how God had rescued them as a people from their enemies in the past. And we're going to pick up the story in John chapter 13. So if you want to pull it up on your phones or follow along on the screen, you're welcome to do that. It was just before the Passover festival, and Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So the timing of this story is really interesting, and I think it makes Jesus' actions all the more significant. This is the night where he will be betrayed and arrested. Tomorrow he is going to die on a cross. So what teaching or example does he want to leave his followers with? What will he do to sum up his message? We continue verse 2. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. You see, normally at the time and in the Middle East, even today, before people settle down to a meal, it's customary that someone will wash their feet. They've had a long walk, probably a dusty journey. But it's only those at the very bottom of the social ladder who were Gentile or non-Jewish slaves who were expected to perform that task. So if you had a Jewish slave, you actually couldn't require them to do this. It was seen as too demeaning, something for the lowest of the low. But because this was a hired room, there were no slaves to wash everyone's feet. So Jesus takes this moment, and apparently knowing what's coming in the days ahead and wanting them to give them a kind of lasting and memorable lesson, he begins to wash their feet. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said that not everyone was clean. All kinds of strange things going on here in this dialogue, and lots of things that we could spend time on, but he knew who was going to betray him. Isn't it incredible that even though Jesus, realizes what Judas is planning to do, he invites him to be part of this meal and even chooses to wash his feet. I was just thinking about how countercultural that is in today's world, where when we disagree with someone or when we're mistreated by someone, we tend to jump to cutting them off, canceling them, demonizing them. But not Jesus. Perhaps he was keeping the door open for Judas to change his mind even at that last minute. Verse 12, when he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." So there we have it. Jesus gives them this incredible example of servant leadership. He teaches them that in God's kingdom, status does not come from having people running around and serving you, but it comes from serving others. He was showing his closest friends that if they wanted to follow him, they would have to live differently. I don't know about you, but I find that so refreshing when I think about the world today and what people are saying and what people are striving for. To have a leader, to have a king who chooses to serve and gives us this model is absolutely incredible. But it doesn't come naturally, does it? Our ego pushes against that when we try to emulate him. And the same thing happened actually in this story with Jesus' followers. Luke's gospel tells us that the very same evening, there was an argument about who was the greatest. If we look at Luke chapter 22, 24 to 27, just jump across to that. It says, "A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. And Jesus said to them, 'The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you're not to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, or the person with the least status, and the one who rules like the one who serves. For who is greater, the one who's at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who's at the table? But I am among you as one who serves.'" I help lead a small team in a charity here at called Bridges for Communities. And they're a wonderful group. Mostly leading them and working with them is a complete joy, but they're also human. And from time to time, they do things which make life challenging as a leader. They don't always remember things. They don't always clear up after themselves. There's a couple or one or two here in the room, so I need to be careful what I say. But I just wanted to share, this is a silly example of where the leadership, the servant leadership of Jesus gives us, I think, all in different ways, probably, that inner challenge. So, at the end of the day, I'm quite often last one, leaving the office, kind of locking up, and there's cups that are left out unwashed. There's even chairs that are not pushed back under the desk. Can you believe it? How would you work with a team like this? Dan Maurice, clocking you in the room. And in those moments, I have this little inner dilemma around, should I say something? Should I challenge them on it? Should I just do it? And I'm sharing this really just as a silly example of the fact that it's Jesus who challenges me in those moments. It's not other leaders from world history. There's lots of other great leaders who challenge me in other ways, but in this area of serving, it's really the example of Jesus that comes to our minds, and we think, what would Jesus do in this situation, and how can I best love and serve my team? There's lots of other little examples I could share, but I won't go into. So, it's an example of Jesus' upside-down kingdom, where the one who rules looks like the one who serves. And I think it was as radical back then as it is today. Some of the greatest leaders in history have, I think, understood this and have even been able to emulate it and follow it. I've actually just finished reading a book by Simon Sinek called Leaders Eat Last. And the title is taken from an idea that even made its way into the military in the US, that people in charge of the troops actually choose as a pattern, as an example, to be the ones who eat last. So this leadership style of Jesus, although radical, is something that people have been able to emulate, and I think should be challenging us too, that if he, as a king, as a person who is literally in the process of saving humanity, could do it, then perhaps so can we. And that leads me on to the second thought, which is about this mystery, this paradox, that God's love was being shown in the Easter story through weakness. And it's not just in the Easter story, it's in the whole of Jesus' life. That though he seemed to be someone great, he seemed to be happy to be in a lower position, to be a person without status. Going right back to his birth and those humble beginnings, being born to a family in a life of poverty. Then over the course of his life, being, it seems, largely obscure for many years of that. And then in the last few years of his life, which are the ones we know most about, the way he treated people, the way he responded to them, the way he served them. And then just in the previous chapter, when he entered the city in a quite bizarre way. And this is something that we may remember next Sunday, which is Palm Sunday. We're remembering this entry where Jesus came sitting on a donkey. And at one point in the story, he's weeping over the city of Jerusalem. So if you put yourself in that situation, imagine showing up and saying, what's this about? What's this rumpus? And seeing a leader sitting on a donkey in tears. It was not the kind of entrance that would have impressed Rome or would have impressed most of the world today, looking for strength, looking for control. And yet, in the midst of that, somehow, mysteriously, there was a joy. There was a freedom about how people were celebrating Jesus. And there was almost a sense of victory. Going forwards to Good Friday, where on the cross, Jesus is put in a position of ultimate weakness. He's stripped, he's humiliated, and ultimately he's killed. But again, amazingly, mysteriously, Jesus wasn't failing as a Messiah. He was actually succeeding. The kingdom wasn't coming through military force. It was coming in God's way through self-giving love, through other-serving love, through sacrifice. And Jesus was taking on that idea that power is shown through strength and that violence is the ultimate solution. By turning the other cheek and refusing to return evil with evil, he was willingly absorbing its impact into his own body. And by doing so, he was having victory over it. If we fast forward to the last book of the Bible, Revelation. John is having this vision of heaven, and it builds and builds, and there's people coming around the throne of God, and it's reaching this climax, waiting for someone who can bring things to completion. And in Revelation 5, it's written like this: "Then one of the elders said to me, 'Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals.' Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The ancient Lion of Judah in this passage, which is a symbol of God's strength and the way that he had intervened for his people time and time again, is revealed, is unveiled to their surprise as the Lamb, a symbol of weakness and fragility. Not only that, it's a lamb looking as if it had been slain. It's a lamb who has been killed, annihilated, the weakest of all, who turns out to be the savior of all, who's at the center of God's throne, and who then becomes the symbol of power. This is the paradox that lies at the heart of our faith, that God's power is demonstrated not in strength or might or wealth or grandeur, as we might think of it, but in voluntary weakness, in sacrifice, and in love. Again, this may raise lots of questions, and one of them, I think a very understandable one, would be why? Why has God chosen to show his power and his love through weakness? And I don't have time to go into a lot of depth on this. I would mainly love to suggest or to request that you ponder it in the weeks building up to Easter. But just to give a clue or a hint from the things that I've been reading and looking at, I think it maybe has something to do with the relationship between power and love. You know, there's an American sociologist called William Waller who came up with what he calls the law of least love. And it basically has 2 parts. The first part is to say that in any relationship, one person loves more than the other. And you can think about or challenge that if you like. But the second part says that the person with most power loves least. And conversely, the person who loves the most is the one who has the least power. If God's defining characteristic is love, and if love is best demonstrated through sacrifice, then the ultimate way for God to demonstrate his love was by choosing to come in weakness. And then from a position of weakness to have victory. So, those are some thoughts to ponder as we approach Easter. But just to finish, and we are going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together in a few moments, what does this all mean for us? Or what could it mean for us? Well, Jesus asked his followers to do 3 things to remember him. The first was to baptize others, just as he had been baptized by John. The second was to remember the meal that he shared with them that evening, which we will do. And the third is to wash one another's feet. You'll be relieved to know that we're not planning to physically wash one another's feet today, although they are doing that upstairs in the hive. So maybe that should be a challenge to us and something we should think about. It's not something we tend to practice literally, but it is something that we can all be thinking about in the roles that we have, in the places where we work, in the homes where we live. You know, some of you are in leadership roles, and I hope that that challenge of the servant leadership of Jesus is something we can continue to think about. But we can all be thinking about ways that we can serve others around us this Easter. It could just be in really small ways, as small as offering to make a cup of tea for somebody that you live with. It can start with an act as small as that. Every small act is a small reflection of what Jesus has shown us and taught us. And the good news that I also wanted to say about this kind of leadership, servant leadership, is that it actually sets us free. You know, many of us I include myself in this, spend our days and our energy trying to give people a good impression, trying not to upset people, trying to build a reputation, trying to cover up our weaknesses. And it's exhausting. But the way of Jesus frees us from the need to do all that. It gives us the opportunity to become less important, not more. And I think as we do that, some of you will have experienced this already, as we choose to serve, as we maybe do things that people may never see, may never thank us for, we actually get to experience little glimpses of freedom, of release, of purpose, of meaning, of joy. In our best moments, those times that we willingly sacrifice for the good of others, we're participating in a small way in the way of Jesus. And we're reflecting in a small way the image of God. The other good news is that I think the more we do this, the more we come to understand God's nature and our own nature too, the more natural and the easier that kind of self-sacrifice becomes. So that's the first thing, is just trying to learn from and emulate the servant leadership of Jesus. The second thing is that whenever you have time to pause in the next few weeks, to contemplate, to consider, I'd love you to think about this mystery of how God's power is demonstrated through weakness. This way that Jesus has shown us of servant leadership and the way he acted in love for us. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be celebrating the resurrection. And rightly so. You know, without the resurrection, the cross is a failure. It's a bitter blow. And the message would be that violence wins, that might is right, that the weak will always be oppressed and abused by the powerful. That's not where the story ends. And Sunday is coming, and we will celebrate the resurrection. But I think it's noticeable that Jesus told his followers to remember his death. You know, he could have waited until after the resurrection. There was that moment where he was sitting on the beach cooking them fish. And he could have said to them, whenever you eat fish, remember that I've risen from the dead. Here I am. Which would have been great. But he didn't. He felt that it was important for his followers to remember his death. And my guess is that it's because his death stands forever as a reminder to us that while God is powerful and God is victorious, that victory has come through voluntary weakness. Such a strange and powerful truth that's been captivating his followers ever since. The strangeness of it is captured in a poem I came across by someone called Stuart Henderson, and it actually became a song sung by Martin Joseph. And I think it captures the shock and the strangeness of the cross quite well. If we can bring that up. He says, strange way to reassure your mother. Strange way to finish your world tour. Strange way to pose for all those paintings. Strange way to gather the poor. Strange dissident of meekness and nurse of tangled souls. It's so unlike the holy to end up full of holes. And it's quite shocking, I think, quite surprising. But for those of us who are so familiar with the Christian story and so familiar with the cross, I think it's good to pause sometimes and re-engage with that. You know, I remember the first time that I was really blown away by the message of the cross. I was 13 years old. My family lived in India, but we were back in the UK, in Birmingham, on a visit. And I heard a preacher talk about it and how the cross was a picture of God's love for me. And I didn't understand it. I still don't understand it. But it blew me away. And in some way, I was able to respond on that day and decide that this was a message I resonated with. There's always more layers to unpack. And Claire has done a brilliant job in her series, What is God Like?, looking at some of the beliefs and doctrines around the cross, how we maybe haven't always understood it well or fully or in healthy ways, some of the limitations of the metaphors that are used to talk about the cross, and that's really, really worth engaging with. But I've also been thinking, as we approach Easter, what do we know? What can we hold on to in our understanding or our knowledge of what Jesus was doing? How can we boil it down to its kind of simplest form? And what I've been thinking about is that he did this for us. He made this sacrifice for us. And even if some of the metaphors around God's wrath or being saved from punishment, etc., have been unhelpful through Christian history, thinking of it in the sense of a person jumping onto a train track and pushing you out of danger, or a firefighter going into a blaze and rescuing you but losing their life in the process, or a policeman intervening in a hostage situation but taking a bullet. That sense of him giving his life for me, of giving his life for you, I think are some of the simple thoughts that we can hold on to as we come to the cross. Jesus asked his followers, "Do you understand what I've done for you?" And perhaps he asks that of us today. The truth is that I don't, and maybe I can't. So perhaps all we can do is agree with Eddie Askew, who says in his book, Cross Purposes, I don't understand what Jesus has done, but I'm sure glad that he's done it. So we're going to finish by celebrating the Lord's Supper and actually going back into some worship together. Because as we remember the way that Jesus gave his life for us, as we remember the way he embraced weakness for us, as we remember the example that he showed to us in his leadership, I think it should stir in us a sense of gratitude and of worship. So I'm going to ask Kyle to come back up, and we're going to spend just the next few minutes. We'll stand again, and when you're ready, in your own time, if you'd like to come up and have some bread and some juice, which are symbols of Jesus' death and, his love for us in this way. So can we stand? And whenever you're ready, come and have the bread and the juice, and then we'll wrap up in a few minutes' time.